Hello, good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland, Scotland at 7. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I'm here in the studio in Cook Gardens, and I am joined this evening by Bill Cruickshank. Bill, delighted to see you and welcome to the programme. As we do every single evening, we begin with the Ukrainian update, which is day 321. Russia is focusing its offensive operations in three key areas in eastern Ukraine. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces have reported in this morning's briefing. Russia is concentrating its efforts on capturing all of Donetsk Oblast by targeting the east areas of Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Liman, the General Staff reportedly said. Ukraine is reinforcing its positions around Bakhmut in the eastern Donbass region after days of relentless assaults by Russian forces, spearheaded by the independent commercial Wagner mercenary group. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in nightly video remarks on Monday that Bakhmut and Soledar were holding on despite widespread destruction. Russia has appointed Colonel General Alexander Lapin as its new Chief of Staff of the country's ground forces, according to state-owned news agency TASS. His appointment comes despite fierce criticism over his performance in Ukraine. Russia will continue to develop nuclear weapons to guarantee the country's sovereignty. Its Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu has said. A Russian warship armed with hypersonic cruise weapons has held exercises in the Norwegian Sea, according to the country's defence ministry. The United Kingdom, meanwhile, is considering supplying a handful of Challenger 2 tanks to the Ukraine. The first time a Western country has indicated it may supply its homemade heavy armour to Kyiv in the war against Russia. The United States, however, is reportedly considering sending Stryker-armed combat vehicles to Ukraine. The move could be announced next week, but no final decision otherwise has been made. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has said its cooperation with the European Union is more important than ever. Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European Council President Charles Michel and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, along with Mr. Stoltenberg, signed the declaration for cooperation this morning. Well, every single day there is yet another example of Russian aggression, but I think more importantly is how Europe is going to look at the end of all this. And I suppose for many of us, Europe was a constant in our lives, and then in 1989, 1991, it all changed, and we are yet again in another generational shift going to see it change again. Do you think there's any hope that there is some form of solution to this soon?
I don't see a solution to the Ukrainian problem, no. I think the only way I see the Ukrainian issue being solved Vladimir Putin, unfortunately for him, dies, because otherwise the man is quite deranged in my opinion. Reminds me very much on Adolf and the way he behaved toward his European neighbours. So unless something happens to Putin or there's a coup in Russia, I don't see this ending anytime soon. And I regret saying.
And from news in Ukraine, we come back home with the Scottish Government debate on respecting Scotland's democratic mandate. In the Scottish Parliament today, there was a very heated debate on respecting Scotland's democratic mandate. Opening the debate, Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson, MSP, said that barely 1 week into 2023, the start choice facing people in Scotland is already clear. He said that the Westminster parties increasingly agree on issues such as austerity and Brexit, and that any change at Westminster will change little for Scotland. He said that the latest attack on trade union rights announced by the Tory government should set alarm bells ringing, adding that this new Westminster law will impose draconian changes to the rights of people working in devolved public services like transport and health, and the Scottish Parliament will be powerless to prevent them. The Constitution Minister said that Scotland can have a different future, pointing to the Scottish Government's recent series of papers, which show exactly what Scotland could do with the full powers of independence, from a new single rate from the national minimum wage to laws that strengthen the rights of workers with flexible working and better industrial relations. He described the Scottish Government's priorities being the polar opposite of the latest proposals by the Tories at Westminster. He continued saying, increasingly the evidence shows that the failing Westminster economic model is holding Scotland back and will continue making us all poorer. No wonder the majority in favour of Scotland choosing a different future is growing. The Scottish Government say they are setting out a detailed blueprint for how an independent Scotland could thrive under a new economic model based on Scotland's abundant renewable energy resources, a new social partnership approach, a Scottish migration policy, and Scotland becoming a member of the European Union in our own right. Mr Robertson finished by saying, if the Westminster parties were hoping that in 2023 they can just put Scotland back in its box, then they have another thing coming. The stakes for Scotland have never been higher. The SNP will never give up on Scottish democracy, and we will never stop fighting for a better future for the people of Scotland as an independent European nation. Well, I didn't watch much of the debate at all, but I hear it was rather heated, and I suppose heat's all that one side of the debate have got left to bring to it. The arguments for me seem to be, in terms of believable, all on one side of the two sides of this coin. Surely the Scottish people aren't daft enough to fall again for some kind of vow.
Well, this whole thing is one of the most serious issues facing the people of Scotland. We've done around about visions for a referendum. In 2021, we voted overwhelmingly for another independence referendum. Now, it seems to me that each of the Westminsters are denying Scottish democracy by not allowing us to vote on our own future. Now, that's not a part of equals. It's not a voluntary union. It's a dictatorship. And the most serious issue facing Scotland today is, in my opinion, more serious than the crisis in the health service or the series of strikes that's undergoing in the. Because if we don't have democracy, we have nothing. And the very fact that the NHS is under strike is simply because of the way the NHS in Scotland is funded. So for me, the Constitution, under everything, and the very not being allowed to vote in our own future, says that about the government and, I'm afraid, the Labour Party.
I think you're absolutely right. It is the most serious topic for debate just now. And yet there seems to be a lot of people who have jumped out of a pram and are throwing toys about rather than engaging in some kind of debate, attempting to make the case for remaining within the union. And, you know, you're absolutely right. There is no longer this fallacy that we're in an equal partnership, that one can leave at one point because it believes it's no longer to its advantage. We're staring potentially another de facto referendum, as the SNP and the Yes movement would like to see with the next election. There is growing confidence within the Scottish people that they have the opportunity to vote yes. And every poll seems to suggest that increasing numbers are beginning to turn into yes voters. Do you think that has got longevity? Do you think it is something that we're going to see continue through to when the next election is called? Because Rishi Sunak doesn't seem to be keen for an election anytime soon.
Well, the problem here is that we've been right to a referendum. So government, Scottish government, are looking at some sort of referendum. It's been criticised, at least by Westminster politicians and even some academics and here. It strikes that the only way we can go forward, unless there is a part of Westminster, which I doubt very much is going to happen, even with change of government to a Labour, Starmer's made it very clear that he vote is Sunak on this, then we have to go, and we have to go with the very election that Kerway. I would imagine the general election, a UK general election, which must be in the next 2 years. So some another holiday, that is the wrong attitude. We can't afford to when Scotland is under serious pressure. We have to as quick as possible. One of the reasons being that we were everyone knows against our will, and I think the Scottish Government and the SNP at their conference, special conference on the 9th of March, listen, the sense of the situation, the democratic situation, or lack of democratic accountability that we now have here in Scotland. So, if I'm going to a member of the SNP to that conference, I will be voting strongly for the first opportunity to go for a de facto end of some kind or other.
And Bill, you mentioned the NHS and the funding of it, and today the Scottish Government have announced additional winter support for Scottish NHS, which is funding of at least £8 million for additional care home beds and efforts to boost NHS 24. The capacity of NHS 24 and those additional care home beds are among the measures outlined by Health Secretary Humza Yousaf to help the NHS and social care deal with the ongoing extreme winter pressure. Health and social care partnerships are going to share that £8 million to procure around 300 additional care home beds to help alleviate pressures caused by delayed discharge. The funding will allow boards to pay 25% over and above the national care home rate for beds. This is in addition to around 600 interim care beds already in operation across the country. NHS 24 is taking forward plans to recruit around 200 new starts before the end of March. In the run-up to Christmas, NHS 24 had already recruited over 40 full-time equivalent call operators, call handlers and clinical supervisors. Guidance has been issued to all boards making it clear they can take necessary steps to protect critical and life-saving care. Mr Yousaf said, "This is the most challenging winter the NHS in Scotland has ever faced, and the immediate pressure will continue for the coming weeks. My thanks to all health and social care staff for their incredible efforts during these exceptionally challenging times. We are ensuring all possible actions are being taken to support services, and the additional measures I have outlined today will help relieve some of the extreme pressure health boards are facing." Bill, the extra funding will obviously be very helpful, but it doesn't plug the gap. And I don't know about you, but my family over the Christmas and New Year period almost had a season ticket for going to A&E due to the amount of bugs and the things that were picked up. And you become very grateful for having that there, even though you may be sitting there on a Friday night looking round at people thinking, jings, there are people in dire straits, worse places than I am. But there has been a chronic underfunding. There has been a chronic lack of support for frontline services in the NHS. And that has been years and years of austerity and years of mismanagement. What's the solution, I wonder?
Well, again, the previous kind of discussion there about the Constitution, for me, the UK government have embarked in the last 13 years on an NHS in the UK. They have deliberately underfunded, they have deliberately understaffed it, created the situation where thousands of people who are very much about the NHS running have left. The same thing has happened in the care homes. I think it was Donald McCaskill was on today and talking about care homes in Scotland and the lack of staff who had left because they felt unwanted in Scotland, but not in Scotland, but UK in general. So the bottom line is the Scottish Government are working one hand behind their back. The NHS in England, the Scottish NHS, is tied through the formula to funding and funding is tied to the England. So if they're putting down the NHS in England, our NHS is not even the same funding if we were an independent nation. And personally, and like yourself, your own family, we've had people in our family in hospital recently, and the care for me, second to none. It was absolutely fantastic. But these people are under so much pressure now because they're understaffed and they're underpaid. And it's about that, back to the Constitution. If we were an independent country with the richest countries in Europe, and we could afford a proper, well-funded and well-staffed NHS, down to the crazy gang when stuff who have a totally different agenda, social or economic agenda to us in Scotland.
Well, one place where the Scottish Government does have its own route map and has its own whip hand in terms of funding and indeed the future is an energy strategy, as they announced today, a strategy to shape the next 25 years of energy production. A route map to secure Scotland's fastest possible fair and just transition away from fossil fuels has been published. The draft energy strategy and just transition plan sets out a plan for Scotland's renewables revolution to be accelerated as North Sea Basin resources decline. This would result in a net jobs gain across the energy production sector, with the potential to increase renewable energy exports and reduce exposure to future global energy market fluctuations. Key policy proposals published for consultation include the following: substantially increasing the current level of 13.4 gigawatts of renewable electricity generation capacity with an additional 20 gigawatts by 2030, which could produce the equivalent of nearly 50% of current demand. An ambition for 5 gigawatts of renewable and low carbon hydrogen power by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045, increasing contributions of solar, hydropower and marine energy to the energy mix. Generation of surplus electricity, enabling export of electricity and renewable hydrogen to support decarbonisation across Europe. Setting out final policy positions on fossil fuel energy, including consulting on a presumption against new exploration for North Sea oil and gas. Accelerated decarbonisation of domestic industry, transport and heat in buildings. Increasing access to affordable energy by urging the United Kingdom government to take stronger, more targeted action for fair energy market reform. Maximising household, business and community benefit from energy projects, including through shared ownership of renewables. Analysis has shown the number of low carbon production jobs is estimated will rise from 19,000 in 2019 to 77,000 by 2050 as the result of a just energy transition, meaning there will be more jobs in energy production in 2050 than there are now. The strategy also sets out recommended actions for the UK government to take in reserved policy areas, including powers relating to energy security, market mechanisms, network investment and market regulation. Scottish ministers have invited the UK government to join an energy transition delivery group to drive forward the vision set out in the strategy. Michael Matheson, the Net Zero and Energy Secretary, said, Scotland is an energy-rich nation with significant renewable energy resource, a highly skilled workforce and innovative businesses across a globally renowned supply chain. The renewables revolution is global as all countries seek to address concerns about climate change, and Scotland is at the forefront of this transition. Bill, one of the things in 2014, of course, was this constant bemoaning of the fact that the Yes campaign would rely economically on fossil fuels and North Sea oil. And what it would appear to be here is a very mature, grown-up approach to the energy market, to the economics of it, to the globalisation of it, to our responsibilities as a global nation. Whilst down in Westminster, they're talking about putting money into nuclear and opening coal mines. If there was a starker difference between the two, and I know we were talking earlier on about the stark difference in the NHS and the economic difference between the two nations, between England and Scotland, this clearly shows the Scots are attempting, maybe shows the influence, of course, with the Greens in government, of a very strong future in terms of supporting us as a nation.
Yeah, well, the problem is, as you know, Donald, in 2014, we were told the oil was running out, and Sir Ian Wood made his millions out of it. North Sea categorically come out and said that the North Sea was finished. It was a mature basin, in fact, a basin. Since then, we last 18 months told that the North is going to rejuvenate the UK economy. So we have a situation where in 2014 the oil was running out, but all of a sudden when the UK needs Scottish resources, the oil might appear in the North Sea. As far as the transition is concerned, if you talk the oil and gas at the moment, there is not a lot of movement in trade and into certainly renewable work going on, obviously, and that's commendable. I really is. But I think energy, as you know, is a reserve this Westminster. Part of the problem, again, back to the Constitution. We, as the government, are working very much within the shadow of Westminster when it comes to energy. Personally, I'm vehement to any nuclear stations in Scotland. Coal mining is a return to the mix and the technology of the 19th century. It's a non-starter as far as the planet's concerned. Really need to up our transitioning oil and gas in the North Sea to renewables. At the moment, I don't see a lot of that going on, and I don't see it happening rapidly under the present UK Tory setup. They are wedded to oil and gas, unfortunately, and it's not can do that.
And of course, the shadow of the UK government is very prevalent at the moment. And today, an accusation has been flung at Rishi Sunak that he is trying to outdo Margaret Thatcher over anti-trade union laws. The UK government Business Secretary Grant Shapps will be able to decide statutory minimum service levels for a string of public services under the terms of a proposed new anti-strike bill, which was unveiled today. Mr Shapps said ministers would consult during the progress of the bill on what minimum services levels would be required for fire, ambulance and transport services, including rail. The measures, which could lead to striking staff being sacked, will also affect health, education, border security and nuclear decommissioning. Explanatory notes for the bill published after Shapps spoke gave no details for what level of minimum services would be required. Under the law, the Business Secretary would be given the powers to make regulations providing for levels of service where there are strikes in relevant services. Employers must consult with unions on what this means in practice before a strike, the bill states. It also confirms that staff who breach minimum service levels will lose employment protections and could be sacked. The planned law will apply to England, to Scotland and to Wales, but not to Northern Ireland. Despite the government's insistence that it's not an attack on the right to strike, unions have labelled it as heavy-handed and likely to exacerbate industrial disputes rather than limit their impact. The Scottish National Party's Glasgow South West MP Chris Stevens labelled the legislation extreme. He warned that Scottish workers are in the firing line after consistent refusals from the Tories to fully devolve employment law to Scotland. And in a letter published at the weekend, the SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn MP, called on the Labour Party leader to back giving Holyrood more powers, a move that would take the rights of Scottish workers out of the hands of the Tories. Commenting, Chris Stevens MP said, "Yet again, Rishi Sunak and the Tories are vying to outdo Thatcher in their contempt for the workers who keep this country running. This time proposing a clamping down on the rights protecting hard-working staff. Square in the firing line are Scottish workers who, as a result of consistent refusal from Westminster to fully devolve employment law, face a stripping back of their basic rights." Well, I don't know where to start with this, really, because you have a Labour Party built on the backs of unions who don't seem to be lifting much than their head to take notice. We have a long, rich tradition, and I know that, when I suggest that there be nae bevying on the picket lines, you'll know exactly to whom I'm referring. And wouldn't you want to have somebody like that, a Jimmy Reid, in the public profile suggesting that this is exactly what it is, a direct attack upon the rights of workers to withdraw their labour when they are under such intense pressure as just now. And it seems, I don't know whether it's an ill-judged move in order to win support for the Conservative Party, or it's just simply part of an orthodoxy that should have been buried along with the 1980s.
Fortunately, I'm old enough to have lived through and worked through Thatcher years. I was very active in my own trade union at the time, and I saw what Thatcher's attack on workers' rights and how much her government tested people. And as far as I'm concerned, this is equally bad an attack on the working class. Jimmy Reid is in my bio on Twitter. He is one of my great heroes, the social cause, with John Lane and Jim Finlay, who are both socialists, Marxists, who fought and died literally for people. So this present, as I said, I've called this crowd in Westwood corrupt gangsters, sorts of names in the past, recent past. And that's because that's what they are. They are nothing corrupt gangsters who are looking for their class and their friends and house. I think the contracts that were awarded during the COVID crisis are an absolute scandal. What has gone on in the last 4 or 5 years, and the quicker we get to them, the better. But the problem is that people in the Labour Party seem to be, and they're quite happy to accept Brexit. You've got Keir Starmer, supposedly named after Keir Hardie, founder of the Labour Party, refusing and telling his MPs not to stand in solidarity with the striking pickets all over the country. He's refusing to let his MPs stand with the work. What sort of socialist party is that? In my opinion, are nothing but red Tories. So once again, to the constitutional question, for fairness, for the working people of Scotland, we must have an independent Scotland. Otherwise, we are relying on an increasing right-wing tendency at Westminster. I the Labour Party in that description right tendency.
It does seem, and I think that what has been interesting is that I don't feel there has been a public wave of sympathy for the government over the strikes. The opposite. I think that a lot of people have seen nurses, ambulance drivers. I mean, these are unusual occupations to feel the need to withdraw their labour, given the profession that they voluntarily entered. And what they're looking for is they're looking for a party now somewhere that's going to stand up for their rights. And the traditional place that they would go to would be the Labour Party, founded through, you referenced Keir Hardie and Keir Starmer being named after him, but you know, there are so many examples from the past. Maxton, you know, we could talk for hours, but it just seems that they feel abandoned by the natural source of their support, the Labour Party, and they have reason to feel that.
Yeah, absolutely, Donald. I think if I'm retired, as I said, I was an active unionist with in the 80s and 90s. One of the problems I have that the workers have is that there is no avenue for support from any political. One of the things noticeable of the recent strikes has been the way that people manipulate the workers' right to strike, their right to a fair, their right to fair conditions. And I think if Mick was to start another, if you like, socialist party in the UK, certainly in England anyway, I'm sure they would be take off, because there are probably thousands and thousands of socialists in England who are looking home. And one of the great disappointments for me in the party today is the refusal to even contemplate getting back into the talking exit language as the Tories. For me, that is an absolute, really abhorrent way to look at things. They call us nasty, they call us all sorts of names. One of the names I like to call is you've got to ask yourself, who sets in the UK at the moment? They are the people who are Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland from the EU, from our European neighbours. They are the real separatists. We in Scotland voted to stay in the Europe. We want to stay in because it protects workers' rights. European, these certain regulations, as you well know, look after workers' rights. For example, at the end of this year, there's going to be going through where maternity rights are going to be under attack, where rights are under attack. This UK government at the moment is going increasingly wrong. For any worker, they cannot look to the Labour Party for help or support. That will have to come from another party in England, and through in Scotland, it'll have to come from independence. My view, anyway.
And at the forefront, of course, is the strikes that today closed primary schools in Scotland. Closed due to industrial action by members of the Educational Institute of Scotland, the IS, NASUWT, and the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association, who have jointly rejected a 5% pay increase, which included a rise of up to 6.85% for the lowest paid staff. The unions are arguing for 10%. However, the Scottish Government say that they are unable to allocate any more money from the fixed Scottish budget without cutting funding from elsewhere. Education Secretary said she was keen to continue dialogue to find a resolution to the dispute, but regretted that the union's pay demands are simply unaffordable. Secondary schools will be closed, it's their turn tomorrow, as the strikes continue for a second day. And Bill, you get the feeling there that, you know, as you alluded to earlier on, the budget, we're tethered to a tombstone in terms not just of policy, but also in finance, and therefore the opportunity to reward people for their good efforts and their principled and indeed professional conduct at work is limited.
And I'm glad you've the issue of the fix, Donald, because a very interesting article today on that very topic. And basically, what the writer was that the two governments, as we know, are no way comparable. The UK government is basically an issuer of the Scottish government is a user of currency. Whereas the UK government can print money as one, and Richard Murphy, the economist in England, has already said this on many occasions. There's no need for anyone to raise taxes the way that government seen that. Again, it's going back to Thatcher, what in her fault. You run the country like a household. It's complete economic nonsense, madness, and square tied to this budget. So and I'm a great sympathy for the teachers who are out today. As I say, I was a member of the EIL, but we cannot rob Peter to pay Paul. Where does the money come from? And again, you go back to the institutional question. Scotland, you pointed out earlier, is an energy nation, probably one of the most energy-rich nations in Europe, if not the Western world. And for people who, like teachers, ambulance workers, nurses, to be scrimping and going to food banks to survive in one of the richest energy-rich countries is an absolute scam. I am solidly behind the workers in this. They've been attacked. Tory government whose philosophy basically that. And we all saw what happened in the 80s and the 90s to workers' rights. There are attacks in the mining communities all over Scotland, all over Yorkshire, etc. So I'm very much behind the workers that are present. If there's a call for a general strike, I would be, because this government, in fact, Ian Blackford said it a few months back. He said these people are out of control, and a truer word said, are totally out of control, and they remind me so much of what Thatcher did of the UK. So I am very much behind the strikers, and as I say, if there's a general call, give us tomorrow, picket lines with the boys in black.
And more worry today was the announcement that Amazon is to close their Gourock warehouse, risking 300 jobs. They announced plans to shut 3 of their 30-plus UK warehouses, which will affect 1,200 jobs across the United Kingdom. Amazon has said that workers from facilities in Gourock, Doncaster and Hemel Hempstead will be offered jobs at other Amazon locations. However, it is thought unlikely that many of the 300 workers at the Gourock site would want to relocate, as there is not another Amazon facility nearby. Steve Gerlich, an organiser for the GMB union, described the announcement as a real kick in the teeth for Amazon staff who worked themselves into the ground during the festive rush. He said hard-up Amazon workers can't suddenly be expected to up sticks and move to a different fulfilment centre, which may be many miles away. Local workers may not be in a position to take roles so far away from where they live. Amazon said the company remained committed to our customers, employees and communities across the UK. The Scottish Government described the move by Amazon as very disappointing, and local MSP Stewart McMillan said in a statement that the news has come as a huge shock, and my thoughts are with the staff affected. It's never a good time to be facing redundancy, but in the current financial climate, it'll be an even bigger blow to the workforce. Mr. McMillan said he would be seeking an urgent meeting with Amazon to discuss their plans for the site. Well, one of the things about the pandemic we know about on Thursday, 8 o'clock, going out and clapping for all the care workers and so on. But we also know that Amazon workers and Amazon delivery drivers, and there are many other delivery companies and many other distribution centres, ordinary people not making an absolute fortune, continuing, supermarkets were the same, to provide us with what we needed to oil our communities to keep us going. And this, given the fortune that Amazon rakes in on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis, without allegedly or necessarily, depending on who you read, providing that tax benefit into the United Kingdom economy, seems to, I was going to say, it seems a bit rich, but I think Amazon's the only organisation that comes out of this a lot richer.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that Amazon epitomises everything that's poor, bad about capitalism. They, as you say, Amazon, we live in a rural part of Scotland, and very people who, for example, drivers here at Asda drive now, certainly in the lanes. I mean, Amazon one of the reliable companies for deliveries to the rural parts. But the people who are delivering are doing such a great, because they're coming out. And in the Highlands of Scotland, you've got during the absolute conditions are very, very poor because of the lack of funding to locals, which really comes from, as we know, again, we go back to the Constitution. But no, I'm all for the workers at Amazon, and I think they've been treated shabbily by the and goes out to the folk at Greenock because they're what a time to lose your job. It's not good. It's really poor.
Certainly isn't. And moving from news at home, we go abroad to more protests, and protesters have gathered at an Iranian prison in an attempt to stop what are described as imminent executions. They've gathered outside a prison near the Iranian capital in an attempt to stop rumoured executions of two young detainees found guilty of running over a police officer in a car during protests in November. Footage posted on social media showed the mother of one of the men, 22-year-old Mohammed Gobadloo, pleading for her son outside a Raji Shah prison in Karaj, a satellite city west of Tehran. She said it had been established that her son had not been at the scene when the police officer died. Human rights activists had raised the alarm after Gobadloo and fellow prisoner Mohammed Burakhani were taken to solitary confinement, which is often a preliminary step before execution. Their lawyers are claiming the two men require a retrial in the Supreme Court. 4 people have been executed so far in relation to the protest movement that has swept Iran since the death in custody of Mahsa Amini in September. Some warnings of imminent executions have proved false, possibly because protests around specific prisoners have unnerved the authorities. Iranian ambassadors in Europe are still being summoned over the execution of 2 men on Saturday, and Iran is now having to weigh up whether to ignore the international condemnation of the lack of due process, including prisoners being denied access to lawyers of their choice. On Monday, a daughter of the former president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, was sentenced to 5 years over propaganda and acts against national security for encouraging people to join the protest. Fazi Hashemi, 60, a former lawmaker and women's rights activist, was charged with collusion against national security, propaganda against the Islamic Republic, and disturbing public order by participating in illegal gatherings, according to her lawyer. The execution of 2 men, Mohammed Mehdi Karami and Mohammed Hosseini, on Saturday led to protests around the world, but no immediate sanctions. The French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna described the executions as appalling, adding that France reiterated its opposition to the death penalty in all places and in all circumstances. French senators have also tabled a resolution calling on the European Union to end nuclear negotiations with Iran, designate the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organisation, as well as several other measures. Bill, the Middle East has always been a hot pot of conflict and protest and worry and concern. And here we have what has been seen, I think, by many in the West as being quite a symbolic protest by women in Iran. But the other side of it here is that the National Guard seem to be picking off some of the protesters, making sure that they are put into prison, and now ignoring any form of due process or justice, leading to summary executions.
I mean, one of the ironic things for Britain to come out in any continent and any Middle East is that it was one of the, like the traitors causes of unrest. At least you only have to look at the Palestine conflict to realise that Britain has played some dirty cards, at least. Saying that, in my opinion, the Iranian should be under heavy criticism for their treatment of human rights protesters, treatment of women. If you look at some of the pictures from the 70s where young Iranian women were in Western clothes and all that sort of thing, and they seemed to be enjoying life and getting to university, higher education, etc. Now it would appear that and Afghanistan are cracking down any right for women, and that appalling situation in 2020. So I would utterly condemn any attacks on human rights to have the same rights as men. I know there are religious issues and all the rest of it. I don't have any time for type of thing at all, but I respect people who do. And if they want to follow religion, and well, long does not impinge on the human rights of other Jews. And the way women are treated at the moment in Afghanistan is simply appalling. And should be by every human rights activist, every decent human being.
And moving from the protests in Iran, we go to Pakistan, where banks and countries have pledged over $9 billion to rebuild the country after catastrophic floods. The international community has promised more than $9 billion to help Pakistan after last summer's catastrophic floods, which were described by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres as a monsoon on steroids. The pledges were made on Monday at the International Conference on Climate Resilient Pakistan in Geneva in Switzerland, hosted by Pakistan's Prime Minister Mohammad Shehbaz Sharif and Guterres. Mr. Sharif has said Pakistan needs a minimum of $16.3 billion over the next 3 years to begin recovery and reconstruction, half of which will be met by domestic resources. The largest commitment on Monday, $4.2 billion, came from the Islamic Development Bank Group. World Bank Vice President for South Asia, Martin Razor, announced a $2 billion contribution. Other contributors have included the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Saudi Arabia, the European Union, Japan and China. Heavy rains, which started in June last year and continued until August, caused Pakistan's worst ever flooding, submerging 1/3 of the country. More than 4 million acres of agricultural land were inundated, resulting in a food crisis and huge financial losses. And the disaster affected at least 33 million people, killing more than 17,000 and leaving a staggering 8 million homeless. We, I think, all looked at the unbelievable images that came across internet and news agencies from Pakistan over the last 12 months when the flooding happened. And of course, the cop this and cop that have all happened, and there have been attempts to do something about the climate crisis, the climate emergency. Now, it would appear that there is at least the beginning of the start rather than the end and the progress perhaps that many would wish for, to try and aid those countries who are at the forefront of this climate emergency to rebuild where devastation and real devastation has happened.
We certainly hope so, Donald. One of the issues, I mean, the Pakistan disaster was a disaster. One of the I'd like to mention here is that India, obviously a close neighbour of Pakistan, and I know the two countries have had their differences thanks to, again, to the British interference in that. And China are huge also fuels. And I would hope that countries like and India favour and say, we really need to adhere to the crisis, because unless the big Russia, India, US get about climate change, then I'm afraid that disasters like Pakistan are going all over. In California, I believe in the last 3 days, been hitting rain coming in the Pacific. Now, that is another situation that climate control, climate is out of control, but it really is down to the huge users of fossil fuel and India, etc. Really try and get their act together and do something about it. It's all for us in part of the world, little Scotland here, trying to do our bit, but we have to come down to the big players in fossil fuels to do something and really get their act together on this, because the Pakistan flooding was beyond words. The flooding it must have caused was indescribable.
As Scots, the diaspora becomes important to us, and I think one of the things that Scotland has is a rich diaspora from other places, and of course there's a huge Pakistani community within Scotland, many of whom had relatives and had contacts and indeed connections with the area. I know one family that I work with on a regular basis down in the south side of Glasgow. They were in Pakistan at the time, but well away from the flooding, and you find yourself emotionally responding to that because you have a connection. And this, more than anything, is demonstrating the global nature of our world now, and also the global nature of this kind of crisis. And it ill behoves anybody, I think, to try and dodge out of their responsibilities here. And I think very often what happens in America and in some commentators on the right, that the first target is the overseas development budget. Charity begins at home. Well, actually, we are now in a situation where charity and support for people who are in dire straits globally means that we are dealing on behalf of people who live in our borders, live in our country, because it is their connection that's really important. It's the internationalism that's important.
I couldn't agree about the international side of things, Donald. Absolutely spot on there. The problem is that I feel that a lot of countries, including the big players, especially in America, if you look at some of the right-wing or politics of America at the moment, it's quite scary what's going on over there. And to an extent, it's mirrored by certain England. But the problem is that these sort of closed-minded secular don't appreciate that we now live in a global situation, and if anything, the crisis accentuated the situation, or accentuated the fact that we live in a world. We don't live within borders anymore, because the COVID crisis proved. A bug starts in man in China and spreads all over the globe and causes absolute chaos all over the globe. So it's about time that, I said earlier, the big players, the big internationals, recognise the fact that we live within a global community, and it's up to every country and up to each individual within those countries to push forward the global agenda. If you like, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, a great Scottish term which was invented here, as you know, and I think that sums it up. We are Jock Tamson's bairns, and we should all work toward helping each other. Unfortunately, people like Putin and some other individuals across the world live in the 19th century of imperial viewpoints and tactics.
Well, indeed, the sentiment as we gallop towards Burns Night is clear, and we return finally tonight to research which has found that Scotland's new domestic abuse laws better reflect victims' experience. Scotland's groundbreaking domestic abuse legislation better reflects those experiences, according to new research, by recognising abuse as a pattern of behaviour The Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018, brought into force in April 2019, closer matches victims' accounts of psychological and physical harm over time, according to 3 small-scale research studies from Glasgow Caledonian University, the University of Edinburgh and the Scottish Government. Responses from 69 domestic abuse victims and witnesses also found most women felt that engaging with the criminal justice system on domestic abuse was the right decision to take. However, respondents also said improvements could be made to how such cases are handled to provide victims with a greater voice in proceedings and better support through the process. Other areas of improvement included making judicial processes quicker and more efficient and providing better training for justice professionals. In February 2022, the Scottish Government published the Vision for Justice, which set out that urgent action is required to ensure women and children are better served by Scotland's justice system. Measures that have already been taken include establishing a victim-centred approach fund, awarding £48 million to provide practical and emotional support to victims, including £18.5 million for specialist advocacy support for survivors of gender-based violence, establishing a £53.2 million Justice Recovery Fund, including £26.5 million for courts, helping reduce the case backlog by 13,000 between January and November 2022, and funding the Caledonian System, which is a programme seeking to change the behaviour of domestically abusive men. Also increasing the use of Police Scotland's disclosure scheme for domestic abuse, helping to safeguard more people who have been harmed or at risk. The Scottish Government has also committed to introduce a criminal justice reform bill this year to bring forward recommendation from Lady Dorian's review on improving the management of sexual offence cases, including introducing a statutory right to anonymity for victims of sexual offences. The bill will also abolish the not proven verdict. Justice Secretary Keith Brown said, "I know it takes incredible courage for those who suffer domestic abuse to come forward, and I am grateful to everyone who took part in this research. We are committed to putting victims at the heart of Scotland's justice system, and the purpose of this work is to use their experiences to make improvements for all." Bill, the thing that jumps out for me here is the fund that's put together in order to work with men. Because I think very often one of the issues is that, and I remember Women's Aid coming in working when I was working in college, and they worked with all the girls, and it was the Women's Aid worker who came to me and said, "Can I go and work with the boys? Because it's them that I really need to get the message to." And I think that men have to take some kind of responsibility. And I think that it's good to see that something's been put in place in order to promote that idea.
I couldn't agree with you more, Donald. I did a stint in the bar myself now. When I was doing a college course, and I did 5 days in the rail. And the things about that experience was that there wasn't. I'm talking, and this was around about 1990, 30 odd years ago. One of the things that struck me was that there was not a lot of listening to that who were in. There was more in to listening to them and turn them around, if you like. It would have been a better place. But that legislation, the way that the research has shown me, is to its progression. It says everything about why I want an independent Scotland. We could be one of the most progressive countries in the world when it comes to things like justice and victims, and how we can turn it around, how we can turn society around.
And with that positive thought, that is it for this evening. Thank you very much, Bill, and I'm very grateful to have you with me tonight in tonight's programme.
Thank you, Don.
And before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford it, £5 a month, please consider becoming a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland. We've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes, and to contribute more in terms of the way that media is seen and media is broadcast in Scotland. So, as well as that, of course, if you're on social media and you see our tweets or you see our snaps or you see wherever it is, wherever it may be, please help us by passing that on and building a movement in order to build a better and a greater choice in terms of media and news in Scotland. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in the studio, and from Bill, who joined me tonight, good night and thank you for watching.